I'm a learning coach and I've trained thousands of students and professionals all around the world. And I'm also actively working and training with Dr. Justin Sung, who's the leading voice in practical learning science with over 1.8 million subscribers on YouTube. I'm only at 740 subscribers as of making this video. So, Justin's 1,799,300 subscribers ahead of me. So, that's we can catch up, right? We'll be able to catch up, no worries. But what we're talking about today is we're talking about how to apply learning skills to live events. So if you're a student, this could be for lectures. If you're a professional, it's for workshops, seminars, and meetings. I've used these and I continue to use these three strategies that we're about to go through here. That helps me actually make the most out of these live sessions and prepare for them very well. And make sure that I forget little information and I'm able to make the most out of my learning, as opposed to me like forgetting everything on that's been talked about in the live event. So the three techniques here, the first one's going to be priming, second one is going to be non-linear note-taking, you definitely cannot read that, and the third one is going to be cleanup. Let's talk about why we use these and then how we're going to use this. So we're going to do that theoretical component first, and then we're going to set the timer, and we are going to take a look at this video here from Huberman. So this is the science of gratitude. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to press play and I'm not going to press pause. I'm just going to demonstrate me doing this process and me trying to make sure that I'm able to just take notes. And you'll see when I do this, how I do it. I'll be speaking out, but again, I'm not going to pause the video. And then after the video is done, we can kind of come back together and we can reconvene on how I did the note-taking here and what the next steps are. So let's talk about why we use priming as the first technique, non-linear note-taking as the second technique, and then cleanup as a third technique. So priming, what is priming? Priming is very simply, before we actually watch this 30-minute video and I continue, so in this situation here, it might be a Zoom class for you, it might be a Zoom meeting or a lecture, it might be an in-person class or lecture for you, it might be an in-person live workshop that you do, it might be a seminar that you go to, whatever it is, right? It might be a meeting. Basically, live events is where you cannot control the flow of information. Information is flowing. You can't just tell the instructor or the MC or your coach, hey, stop, I was going to take some notes. And then you take notes and then you tell, oh, you can continue. You can't do that. Information is always coming in, but we're not able to control the order at which information is coming in. We're not going to be able to Google as much information potentially, right? We need to listen to our lecturer, our professor, whoever it is that's speaking. So priming is essentially before that live event occurs. So let this be the live event itself. If this is a timeline, in orange, priming is everything that happens before, right? Priming is the processes that happen before the live event for you to get prepared for it. So you can call it preparation. We tend to call it pre-study in our practice. This is anything that happens, again, before this live event to prepare you for the live event. Now, most people do not prime. So they just kind of rock up to a lecture and that's like the first exposure to the content. So we're about to watch this really small video. It's 34 minutes only. I would be open to doing a 90-minute video, but then this video is going to be like really long. And, I got feedback from the previous video, it was just too long. So I do want to make sure that it's a bit tighter. But again, this is the same process I would apply to something if it was 90 minutes, if it was 2 hours, if it was 3 hours, however long it is. So that's the priming step. Let's continue talking about it. Priming is essentially anything that you do in preparation for the live event. Any pre-reading, pre-learning, taking a look at the agenda, doing your basic scaffold, or you're doing your layers and trying to understand how to actually make sense of the information that's about to come up. That's what you do for priming. And priming is better than no priming. You definitely want to make sure that you get at least some reps in for preparation. So even for some busy doctors that I train, some of them have situations where they're with senior doctors and they're on the ward floor and they need to be able, they can't even actually take notes, but they kind of know what rotation they'll be doing, or they kind of know which doctors will be on board, etc. So for them, even 5 minutes of priming can make a very big difference. So what that means is before they go into the consultation, they might quickly take a look at their notes, they might quickly revise certain processes that they're thinking about, etc., before the actual live event occurs. So we'll talk more about how we're going to do priming, but let's quickly talk about why priming is very useful. The first one, I've actually got the definition out here because I really want to make sure that we both get on the same page. It's a learning strategy where we expose ourselves to a certain stimulus. In this case here, let's just make it a lot easier to remember content. And what we're doing is that we're just trying to think about the content in a certain way so we can activate relevant schemas, so prior knowledge in our minds. And so when we actually sit in the live event, it's not going to be our first time thinking about the information. It's going to be our second time. It might be our third time if we decide to do multiple priming sessions. And that's very useful because now, instead of scrambling around and having to figure out, oh my God, like, where do I write this? Where do I put this? What does this concept mean? You have like a general understanding. And so you'll be able to generally fit things in. So when I watch this video, inevitably, when it comes to live events, something I should mention here as well, your brain, here we go, let me draw your brain again. This is such a bad drawing. Your brain, essentially, there's information coming into the brain in the form of sensory information. And your brain actually has to process this information and think about it a bit more in order to send it to its memory and, what we call long-term memory. The inevitable fact of any live event, and this will go for any learner, even advanced learners, even people that have lots of exposure with learning efficiency and getting better at learning, the rate at which information is coming in is going to be significantly higher than your ability to process that information. So what that means is that, yes, even though you will be able to process it and increase your rate of processing, very rarely are you ever going to be in a session, even when I watch this video, will you perfectly be able to understand and recall all the information. It's inevitably going to be the fact that there's so much information coming in, you're going to have to be selective about what information that you put onto your notes and what information you decide to take. So that's why priming is useful. Number one, it helps us activate existing prior knowledge. And number two, it also reduces the complexity during the actual live session because we've had some exposure to it in the past. And the last one that we're going to put here is that it actually allows us to learn more, because what we've done is that we've taken the time to develop some sort of foundation. So as we're doing our live event, as the information's coming in, inevitably, because it's going to be information that we are not going to be able to process a lot, we can quickly just figure out, okay, cool, I'm just going to put the information down. I'm just going to forget about it. But at least you've done that tiny bit of processing. So priming essentially increases the rate of information that you're able to process. So if we just do like a super, super simple example, let's say that there is like 100 things that is being delivered to you. Your processing efficiency might only allow you to do 30 things in this live event. But if you were to engage in this priming process, you can slowly upgrade that to 50, 60, 70, but you're never going to be able to get to 100 per se, because again, unless the delivery of the information is super, super slow, which sometimes it is, you're not going to be able to remember all of it, just because people, when they speak, even as I'm speaking in this video, you're slowly understanding it, but inevitably there's going to be parts of it that you forget. That's because your brain is just like that. You'll be able to process everything here per se, and you can slowly increase that. And one of the ways of increasing your processing efficiency, what we would otherwise call your encoding efficiency, is through priming, and it's one of the easiest ways of practically doing that. So that's why priming helps a lot. Now, how are we going to do it for this video here? This video is only 34 minutes long, so it's not actually that long. Now, most of the workshops or seminars or meetings that people have, I see on average, it usually takes people an hour. Now, if it's longer lectures, it's going to be towards 90 minutes to like 2 hours kind of thing, like 1.5 hours to 2 hours. And if it's really on the long end, sometimes it goes up to plus 5 hours. So just someone speaking for 5 hours straight and then people having to like listen. So these are the rough times that I see for the live events themselves. And therefore, what would actually happen is that the amount of time that we spend priming is going to be proportional to the amount of time that the live event's going to go for. But again, what we actually want to do here is we want to be quite strategic with this priming session. We want to make sure that it's not enough time to go through everything. And also, we need to make sure that we at least get it done. I understand that some people are very busy, so sometimes they can't even get like a 10-minute priming session done. But essentially, the rule is if there's any amount of time that you can spend on priming, just do it. So if it's like 2 minutes, even do those 2 minutes. Right? If that means literally, if it just means going to ChatGPT being like, hey, I've got an event, I've got like a lecture on anatomy today, specifically talking about the anatomy of the fist, right? If you're studying like MSK, I need to learn more about it. Can you just give me the main ideas? 2 minutes, boom, quickly read through ChatGPT. Oh, cool, it's going to talk about these parts, done. Like that is still useful. And that's like the bare minimum. So if anything, the amount of time that you want to be spending on priming is just any time that you can get. So ideally, there should never be a live event that you enter that you have not done any priming for. Because at that point, what you're doing is that you're accepting the fact that your processing efficiency, your encoding efficiency is going to be a lot lower. But I should also note, it goes back to your personal preference. Personally, for me, this is my own opinion. I've noticed that I've just attended far too many live events where I've forgotten so much information to the point where I get really frustrated with myself because I'm going to these live events for a reason. Like there's a reason I'm attending a workshop or going to like a seminar or going to some sort of event or I'm listening on. There's a reason I'm there. I want to learn. And therefore, if I'm there to learn, I may as well make the most out of that time because I've had too many experiences where I've gone to workshops and I've had friends being like, "Hey, what do they talk about?" And I can't even give like a broad overview. It's just I just forgotten the information. So for me, my philosophy is that I want to make the most out of any learning opportunity that I get. And anytime I am not able to do that, it's just a waste of time. So that's why I'm quite big on this sort of thing where it's like you may as well make the most out of your learning because you are physically going to be there. And for that reason, very rarely do I ever go to any event where I don't do any priming. Very rarely. You know, some of you might be thinking, oh, but I kind of want to just enjoy and hang out with my friends. And you can do that for sure. But again, my philosophy is that I've just been way too frustrated with so many opportunities to learn, so many books that I've read, so many videos that I've watched that I've forgotten anyway, to the point where it's like, what's the point of even watching it? I want to make the most of my learning. That's why I spend any time on priming. So that's a bit of a tangent. Now, what do I recommend for times of priming? If your live event is 1 hour, I recommend around a 15-minute priming session. That's usually quite reasonable, especially if you're a student. You'll have 15 minutes anyway, because some of you are spending 50 minutes, if not an hour, on TikTok and scrolling. So you've got time, right? You want to make time for this. You definitely want to prioritize something like priming. If it's towards the 90-minute and 2-hour block, this is where you can start to do 30-minute priming sessions. This is a good amount of time. This is actually like the ideal amount of time. This is the amount of time that I usually recommend most learners, just because most live learning events tend to be like that 90-minute, 2-hour slot. I rarely see it go to like 3 hours, etc. But if it is beyond something like 2 hours, if it's something crazy like 5 hours, then it can be more reasonable to spend around 45 minutes here to 1 hour. So you can see that it is proportional to the amount of time that the live session is for, but it's not actually directly proportional. So it does not scale perfectly. What do I mean by that? So if you have a 2-hour live event, spending 30 minutes priming is useful. But then if you're deciding to do a 4-hour live event, you're not going to times that 30 minutes by 2, especially if it's the same content. If it's part of the same content and part of the same like general study, you would want to just add 15 minutes. So I would actually kind of add a 1.5x multiplier. I know that's a bit confusing, but I'll say it again. I'll just give a really quick example. So if you're like a student and you're deciding, you notice that one lecture is like 90 minutes, for example, right? So reasonably, this would be good to spend, doing a 30-minute priming session for. But if you decide to do another lecture here as well, and these lectures are actually related, then now you're spending 180 minutes, so, 3 hours, but you don't want to do a 60-minute priming session. You probably still want to keep it to that 30-minute or 45-minute mark. And the reason that's the case is because you still want a little bit of pressure during this process where you're forcing yourself to find the major way of structuring this information and doing that. Now for this video, since it's 34 minutes, I will probably only do a priming session for 10 minutes. So I'll do it very simply, but again, if I was actually doing like a real demonstration, I would couple this with another video. So then it would be like an hour's worth of content. And then I might do potentially like almost like a 15-minute pre-study on that, a 15-minute priming session, right? So that's how we'll do the priming session. And now the last thing here is specifically, that's the time that we're going to spend. How are we actually going to do it practically? Practically, we're going to use mind mapping approach here. So that's what I usually tend to use. I use a mind mapping approach for my note taking. We're going to talk about that in the nonlinear note taking section. And then what's going to be done here? What we're going to do now is we are going to then find what the major concepts are going to be. So I want to build that structure for this knowledge, and I also want to rely on that prior knowledge too. So, we're going to be studying a little bit about the science of gratitude and how to build gratitude practice. So I'm going to think more about some things that I know about gratitude practice in these 10 minutes, and I'm going to map that out. I want to figure out what those major ideas could be, and we're going to get the trusty old timer out again, and we're going to do the demonstration of that. And then we're going to press play on the video, and the idea is that we will take this priming session that we've done and the notes that we've taken here into the live event. So now what's happening is you are actually entering the live event with something. You're not just entering with nothing, and there's nothing going on in your brain. It's the worst thing you can do for yourself. You are entering this live session knowing that you've done some research, knowing that you've got these notes that you can take with you practically, and now you just add onto that schema, you add onto that foundation. You're not starting from scratch, you've already done the hard work, and this is very powerful, especially because during a live event, the information that's coming in is just way too high to the point where we can quickly just decide to put information in the different parts of the map as opposed to just being like, okay, just passively learn it and then forget it anyway. So that's the first step, that is priming. Let's quickly go through these two before we start the 10-minute timer for me to do the priming, and then we'll play the video and then we'll do everything else. The second one is non-linear note taking. And specifically, we're actually going to be using the grind principle. So this is actually a mind mapping technique developed by Dr. Justin Sung. He's got a video on it. The video is quite old, so I'm going to quickly just recap our latest way of thinking about it. Now, what does grind stand for? I'm going to talk about the how before I get into the why. It's a bit easier. So grind stands for grouped, relational, interconnected, you cannot see that, right? Nonverbal, directional, and emphasized. So that's what it means. And I've totally decimated that diagram, so you probably can't tell what that is, right? So that's something that you're seeing there. That's what grind is. Now, why are we using notes to begin with? So don't think about the nonlinear note-taking part too much. Let's just think about note-taking. Again, the research exists on note-taking. There's lots. It's kind of hard to read, not going to lie. It's also not super practical. Like, you kind of read at the end, it's like, oh, cool, and what? And it's not as nuanced, and again, it's research, so it's quite surgical. I should say that there are, basically TLDR, if you take a look at the literature, people on average that take notes compared to not taking notes, they tend to just have a better grasp of the material. TLDR, that's like a very big kind of just, generalization, and generally it's true. That's what you tend to see. And the reason that's the case is because putting information onto notes, even if it's done quite poorly and passively, it does require like a little bit of thinking, right? A tiny bit of thinking. Even if you're just kind of being very passive, there's a tiny bit of processing and mental effort that's invested. And that's why TLDR, note-taking, is better than none. There is a very big exception to this, because you will see that there are certain people that take lots of notes during live events, right? And then there's that one guy in the room. He's just sitting in the corner and he's not taking any notes, but he's thinking really deeply about this content. And so what I do want to mention here is that although, yes, note-taking on average is better than not note-taking, this does not mean that how do I say this? This does not mean that people who don't take notes will do worse than people that do take notes. Because at the end of the day, learning happens in the brain. And I see this all the time with certain students, that they're able to just sit in the class, and because they're really deeply thinking about this information and they're exerting a lot of mental effort, although it might not seem like they're not taking any notes, the learning is happening in the brain. And that's also another principle that we want to remember. Even though, yes, we are taking notes, learning happens in the brain. So the reason we're taking notes is so we can trigger certain cognitive processes, so we can invest that mental effort into learning, and therefore we experience that benefit, what we call cognitive load. So it's kind of like going to the gym, right? You want to lift heavy and really strain your muscles, because that strain and that destruction of your muscles is what makes it bigger. So very similarly, when it comes to learning, that mental effort to trigger a favorable cognitive response, that actually leads to good quality learning. So you can see how it's quite complicated here, and this is not, the research really doesn't really talk about this part that much, about the nuances of note taking and how learning actually happens in the brain. Notes, the purpose of notes is to trigger a cognitive response. It's not for you to necessarily then come back to it and review it. Yes, that is one of the benefits of note taking, because you get to review what you've done before, but your notes are useless if it's not in your brain. Right? I was speaking to a friend the other day. I remember we were talking about a certain concept, and I kind of forgot something that we were talking about. We were studying a book, and I forgot one of the points that was mentioned. I'm like, oh, dude, I can't remember it. There's 2 points. There's 2 major points that was mentioned. I remember the first one, but I couldn't remember the second one. And my friend was like, oh, dude, you can just refer to your notes. But I just straight up told my friend, I'm like, dude, it's useless for me to even refer to my notes if it's not in my brain, right? The notes need to be in my brain, not on that. So, that's like an experience there. Another experience really quickly, I remember a friend and I, we kind of went to a workshop together, and we were taking notes on a piece of paper. And what happened was, the class was done, and then it was raining really bad that day. So what actually ended up happening is that our notes kind of got drenched in water. And then my friend was like, oh no, like, oh dude, I remember so much, I took so many valuable notes, and now it's all gone. But for me, I'm like, yo dude, it's in my brain. I can recall everything. Genuinely, that's actually what happened. I'm like, this is what happened, this is what happened. And on the train ride back home, I just taught him everything that I remember. And he was like, dude, how do you even remember that? And this is the process. This is like literally actually it. So, it's kind of like a flex if you can do this really well. Now, that's what the note-taking process is. So that's what note-taking is for. We just talked about note-taking. Let's talk about the non-linear aspect of it. What does non-linear mean? Let's start off with what linear means. Linear notes is when you just type, right? So do you see this text here? Like, this is a linear format if you take information in this way, or if you write information like that. And linear formats are useful because that's how information is usually stored, especially with the printing press being released, and it's a very efficient way of writing information and communicating it. So you can see Huberman said, thank you for watching, please subscribe. So you can see like this is a very efficient way of communicating this information. So this is good to read, but just because it's an efficient way of storing information, it doesn't mean that it actually triggers a favorable cognitive responses. So when people usually do typed notes or even written linear notes, it very rarely leads to the type of thinking that your brain needs to do in order to deeply think about the information. So that's why linear notes, so if you're doing typed notes, if you're doing written notes, handwritten notes like that, it's not actually advantageous because of all of these favorable things that we would want for our brain to think about, or these processes, because these processes lead to us exerting more mental effort, and therefore it's kind of like analogous to the gym, right? If you have good form, you'll be able to develop good muscle. But taking linear notes is kind of like setting the weight to like the lightest one and then doing many reps, but then you just keep doing the reps and it looks like you're exercising, but there's no strain on your muscles. And therefore you exit the gym and you're like, dude, I went to the gym for 2 hours. But then it's like, dude, you didn't even make any progress, right? And then it's been a year and you're like, oh, dude, I've been going to the gym for a year, but I still haven't really made any muscle. I haven't really lost any weight. It's because you're doing the wrong things. It looks like you're doing the right things. But again, remember, learning happens in the brain. Very similarly, muscle growth happens in the muscles. And so the muscles need to feel like a level of strain for you to determine whether or not your muscles are growing. So that's what linear notes are. If we just had to really quickly define it, it's just notes that kind of look like this. Most people take linear notes. Non-linear notes is notes that kind of look like mind maps. It's like a super simple way of saying it. There's definitely a definition, but I can't be bothered thinking about the formal definition. I don't even think it's that useful. But nonlinear notes is essentially where you are connecting ideas together. You're trying to identify how ideas could be grouped together. And grind is actually the nonlinear note-taking strategy, the mind mapping strategy that Dr. Justin Sung teaches on his YouTube channel. I'm also using it because honestly, it's a lot easier to just not reinvent the wheel, because this actually does the job. Yes, I could rechange it and I could add a bit more nuance to it, but grind is good enough in my opinion. as a idea. And the reason nonlinear note taking is powerful is because it actually has a higher likelihood. What did I say? I said higher likelihood of engaging in those favorable cognitive processes that lead to increased mental effort during the actual note-taking process and during the live event, during the learning process, and as a result, leads to better retention and leads to better learning outcomes. The reason I say higher probability is because it's actually also dependent on your technique, accuracy, consistency, difficulty, and speed. So what that means is most people that have actually done mind maps and don't find benefit, it's because they're just not doing it correctly, just full stop. So again, very similarly, we know that going to the gym helps with muscle growth. It's just a fact of life that going to the gym helps with muscle growth. And if you do enough resistance training and cardio, you will build muscle and lose weight. TLDR, right? So one can go to the gym, but again, very similarly, if their form is off, and most of the time their form is off when it comes to mind mapping, they won't get the benefit of going to the gym. If you're doing deadlifts, but you're only doing like the 20 kilo bar and you're not adding weights onto it and your form is bad, it's going to end up worse. You might even injure yourself. So in the example of a gym, it's a lot easier to see if your form is bad because you can actually feel it, right? It's like, oh, dude, I strained my hamstrings and it's been 5 days and it's still feeling bad. Probably injured yourself. Or like you don't see any muscle growth and it's been like a month since you've gone to the gym, or you are slowly gaining weight. So it's like, okay, well, the outcome is not matching. So in the gym example, it's a lot easier to remember it. I would also say in the learning example, it's a lot easier, but just because a lot of people really don't know how to learn and they've never been taught how to learn, and there's a lot of literature that exists that a lot of people make very uninformed decisions about how to learn. When it comes to mind mapping, and because they're not familiar with what good learning looks like, they don't know what good form looks like. And so a lot of people make the assumption, oh, my mind mapping didn't work. It's like they just make the assumption that they knew how to mind map to begin with. And it's like, dude, your form is off. Like instead of challenging the actual technique, challenge your form first. Identify if it's being done well. And then if the form is still not, if you're still not getting the favorable outcomes in form of retention and mastery, you need to be more critical about the form. Genuinely, you just get to be more granular about it. So it's very challenging because with learning how to learn, with learning how to learn, the reason it's challenging is because, again, learning happens in the brain. And the other bigger reason is because a lot of people aren't just educated on what good learning looks like and feels like as well. So that's a bit of a tangent around why nonlinear note-taking is best. I should say that any form of offloading is like the bare minimum. So you will see sometimes, for example, I've actually trained a few doctors, I think I said this earlier in the video, who are not able to actually carry like an iPad or pencil paper into a consultation with a patient because the patient's sitting there, and imagine as a doctor, you're just drawing stuff on the iPad. It's not allowed. So there's actually rules against that as well. There's certain rules. There's certain software developers I've worked with. Their bosses, for some reason, just don't allow them to bring in like paper into the meetings. And so if you really need to, number one, I recommend even getting like a smaller kind of, process. So at least you have something to offload thoughts onto. So that's what I mentioned here with offloading. The bare minimum is that ideally you've got some place to put information. But then if you don't, then you got your hands as well. I've done it sometimes. I don't do it a lot anymore. I'm not that barbaric. Sometimes I'm usually carrying like small sticky notes or even a small journal. But at the end of the day, remember, learning happens in the brain. So you'll be able to see once you actually train your ability to think in a certain way and trigger these favorable cognitive processes, what you'll see is that even if you do not take nonlinear notes, even if you take linear notes, if you know what good learning feels like and looks like and what those outcomes are, you will be able to actually do really well with linear note taking. So what do I mean by this? A quick example. If you get two people who are both typing away and both taking notes, chances are one of them is going to have better retention and depth than the other. It's just statistics, right? If you take two people who are relatively different, it might seem like they're both taking notes. It might seem like they're both using Notion. They're both studying the same amount of hours. They both have the same teacher. They're both learning the same thing. But I can guarantee you this. If you drag them out of class and you were to ask one of them, hey, can you just recall what you learned? One of them will recall and the other one will recall. Guaranteed there'll be someone that's able to recall just a little bit more, right? Very similarly, if they were to do an assessment, there would probably be one of them, probably the one that has more retention, that does a lot better on that test. And again, the reason that's the case is even though it looks like they're using the same technique, it looks like they're putting in the same amount of effort, it looks like they're doing the exact same thing, learning happens in the brain and it's invisible. So the person that tends to remember the information more, or being able to, again, have greater depth and therefore perform better on assessments, the reason they're able to do that is because they are actually having better invisible cognitive processes engaged in than the other person. And this is why, again, if you were to ask these people, what should I do to study? They would, again, a lot of people just don't know these favorable cognitive processes that are occurring. What we call this, it's more of the fancier terms, we call this a higher level of innate deep processing, innate meaning like internal. And there are two major factors that influence this: childhood experience and genetics. So if you know a friend who's never done any prior cognitive retraining, but they've been smart all their life and they study a little and they're able to get high marks, the reason that's the case is just because they have innately higher deep processing skill than most other people. So they don't really have to do a lot. They were born that way, or there were childhood experiences that allowed them to think in that way. The cool thing is that you can retrain and increase your ability to process information, so you can increase your deep processing ability. And that's what cognitive retraining is, right? And that's the type of work that we do with learning how to learn. So that's why we're going to do nonlinear note taking. That was quite a long explanation, and we're going to do it through the grind principles. I'm going to quickly explain some of these just really quickly. So grouped, what does grouped mean? Essentially, if we are taking notes in this live event and there's going to be lots of information that Andrew Huberman, Dr. Andrew Huberman is going to give me, I want to make sure that I take ownership and I reduce that information into manageable portions. This process is called chunking. So for example, I imagine that Dr. Andrew Huberman, he's going to have many points to explain to me, potentially 20 or 30 different ideas that he explores in this video. And what I want to do is I want to take ownership and group them into ways that make sense to me. This chunking process has been well researched, and essentially it shows that it demonstrates that it increases retention, it increases the recall of certain things by reducing them into smaller groups and manageable groups, and you actually remember more. So instead of memorizing a list of 30, what you're doing now is that you're just remembering a list of 4 major groups, and under each of those 4, there might be 7 in this one, there might be 3 in this one, there might be 5 in this group, and there might be 15 in this group. And then the one in the 15, you tend to also manipulate that to make it into subgroups or sub-chunks. And that way, now it's a lot easier to recall everything, because now you're working with 4 major groups, and then you're working with those elements there, and then you've got the 2 subgroups that you're working with, and you've got all those elements there. So that's like a TLDR of chunking and what it means. There's lots of research behind how it increases learning outcomes. There's another thing that's talked about here, which is called multiple element interactivity. What multiple element interactivity says, it's just a very fancy word for saying the more that you learn, it's actually just harder to juggle all of that. So you want to make sure that you learn in more manageable portions. And the way that people do this is by reducing their information intake. But that's actually not a very efficient or a good decision, again, because you don't want to be limiting the amount of information that comes in, because then what happens is that your study volume scales with the amount of information that you have. So grouping is a very powerful technique to, number one, not overcome per se, but leverage multiple element interactivity in a good way, where you are focusing on creating meaningful groups and clusters of information. You're investing cognitive load, you're investing mental effort into creating these groups, which therefore increase the retention of you being able to remember this content. So a very simple example is like, if there's like all of this content here, I would want to be like, this would be very overwhelming to remember if I did linear notes. But if I did non-linear notes, I can be like, oh cool, like this one is here. That's one major group. This seems to be one major group. This seems to be the third major group. And I've done that. And by remembering these 3 major groups, it will also just give me a little bit of a hint on what the groups were about. And so there we go. I now don't think about this whole page as like 5 different pages. I think about them as 3 major groups. And then thinking about the group itself, it cues me on what belongs in the group and how I made the decision to group it in that certain way. So that's what grouping is. Relational is the next one. So relational is not too hard. Relational is when you are starting to connect the information together. So this is when I might be like, oh, cool, this group tends to lead into this. So this is group 1, and then it leads into group 2, and then there's group 3 here as well. So this is very powerful because this actually helps a lot with understanding the way that information interrelates, and information, the way it's structured, it usually relates. So you can see, like, even in this paragraph here, thank you for watching, you can see it's Andrew Huberman. Andrew Huberman is expressing gratitude, and the way that he expresses gratitude is by saying thank you. That's how he expresses it. So you can see there's already like connections of information here. And then this gratitude is then followed by an action of subscribing. There's 2 actions, the subscribe and then the bell icon. And again, he thanks us for this interest in science. So he thanks us for 2 things. Number 1, watching, but then our interest as well. And it's from Andrew himself. There's like many ways you can connect that information, and that's what relational means. There is a little bit of research into this. It's called, so you can refer to Bloom's revised taxonomy here. It talks about the lower orders of thinking and the higher orders of thinking. And essentially, the higher orders of thinking are associated with increased mental effort, and increased mental effort usually signals a favorable cognitive process that's going on, which leads to greater attention. So when we do our live event, we're able to remember everything, and that's like a triangle, and you'll be able to see it. This is higher order thinking skills and then lower order thinking skills. And essentially, when you relate information, it makes you think at those higher orders because you're having to think about the information and how it connects. For example, we said 1 leads into 2, and then we said 2 leads into 3, but we didn't say 2 leads into 1. There's a deliberate reason as to why we did that, and that decision-making process leads to you being more intentional and more active during your learning. Okay, cool. Let's go through these other ones here. We are up to I. Interconnectedness just means that we're trying to find out ways the information all relates together. So if there's a relationship that exists between 2 and 3, we would actually want to represent that. Very rarely do we want to have segmented notes. So I'll demonstrate what this looks like when I actually do the process. But essentially, the reason interconnectedness helps is, number 1, it's like an increased form of relational. It's being like, okay, cool, you can be relational, but be really relational, okay? Just don't stop. Just keep thinking about the relationships. Number 2, it's also a useful memory cue. And the reason that helps is because when you want to recall these notes, if you know that everything connects onto the map in some way, shape, or form, everything is interconnected, as opposed to it being a map and there's one part there, there's one part there, and they're not connected, those arrows in themselves, the way that you connect the information, it leads, it makes you think about the information. It's like, oh, cool, it kind of connects there, it belongs there, it belongs there. I know everything connects in some way, shape, or form. So that's why interconnectedness is quite powerful. Essentially, when you recall these notes, it's easier to remember, oh, cool, like it's all connected, and what arrows and what links kind of connect the information. Non-verbal, not too hard. We're drawing pictures and abstract visuals when need be. This is a level of lower order processing, but it's not the lowest order of processing. It's one of the it's a process where, like, again, you're like looking at information, you're trying to make it abstract, you're trying to make it crazy. So if something in gratitude, it talks about, be thankful for your family. People, when they tend to visualize, they'll just draw like a hug emoji or like a hug thing, and they'll just say family. But I might think about what's a way that I've been grateful to my family. I buy them pizza. So then in my notes, I might just draw pizza. And pizza is actually a lot more memorable than like drawing people hugging, because that's quite absurd to me. So that's a non-verbal aspect that, again, increases the memory. It acts as a memory anchor, a memory cue for your map and for your notes. So you'll be able to remember, oh, it's talking about pizza here. So even if you don't remember the actual concept, you can now trigger, oh, cool, pizza. Oh, cool, I buy pizza to express my gratitude, right? So that's something you can do there. Cool. And we've just got these 2 one here, directional and emphasize. Directional just means when it comes to relations, we want to make sure that we are being deliberate with the direction or the flow of information. So again, I said 1 leads into 3. I didn't say 1 is related to 3. It's not like an arrow. It's a relation. It's like a direction. It's like 1 leads into 3, or 1 causes 3, or 1 infers 3, 1 influences 3, or I might even be like 1 and 3 interrelate. Maybe I might be like 1 and 3 interrelate, but 3 influences 1 more than 1 influences 3. So we're being very intentional there with our relationship. We're not just being like, oh, cool, done, right? 1 leads into 2. It's like, 1 leads into 2, but could 2 lead into 1? Yeah, it could actually. And 1 actually has to occur first, and then 2, and then it leads back into one another. Or it might be like, you know what? Maybe they interrelate. So you would have to take ownership of the information there and identify what that is. Finally is emphasize. What this just means is that when we create the map, we don't want the map to be homogeneous. So it's like, a lot of people when they create maps, it's kind of like this, right? It's like whatever, right? Kind of like that. And then what's actually happening is that everything looks the same. Everything here is like, dude, like all of it is just looking so similar. So what you actually want to do is, because not all the information is the same. Again, information is hierarchical, right? The information that an author talks about at the start of the book is not as profound or foundational as the information that an author might talk about at the end of a chapter. There's a reason they started with certain information, because they thought it was more important. So what you want to do is you want to be the active agent of prioritizing information over one another. And so if the information is more important, you would want to find a way to emphasize that information. And if it's less important, then you would want to find a way to suggest and tell yourself, cool, this information is not as important. So in this example here, I might be like, cool, purple is like the most important ideas, orange are the sub-concepts, then teal are like the outside details, and then finally, the teal is outside concepts, and then finally, maybe in yellow, these are like all the things that I need to memorize. I might just put them onto a second brain, I might put them onto flashcards, whatever you might do here, right? So what you're doing is you're actively identifying, cool, not all the information is equally important. Let me emphasize the information that is the most important. So again, you're actually engaging in that prioritization process. And again, prioritization is one of those higher orders of thinking from Bloom's Revised Taxonomy. 2001, I think, is the reference, if you want to make reference to that. Cool. Sweet. All right, so that is non-linear note-taking, and that's why it's a lot more powerful than other note-taking skills. And you can see we're not actually talking about note-taking very in-depth in this video. It is meant to be for live events, and I will watch this video. We'll get into it. Last part is cleanup. This is actually not too hard. So what will happen is the reason we need to clean up is because inevitably when I take notes, it's going to be very messy. So even though, yes, I'm going to have like a mind map that's going to have emphasized, I'm going to emphasize in orange, and this might be like my mind map that I get from priming. Here we go. This might be the mind map that I developed from priming. What I 100% expect, and this always happens to me, pretend this is my priming mind map, right? What happens when I go into the main event, so this is the actual live event, my notes end up looking like this. It like literally just looks like this. I've got a new form of ideas that are forming. There's like lots of this, and then it's like, nope, it doesn't look like that. It's actually this one that leads into this one. Literally, like this is actually what my notes look like. So the reason this happens again is because the rate at which information is coming in, it's going to far exceed my rate of processing that information. So a lot of it, yes, even though I do attempt to process the information, a lot of it's just going to be offloading. It's like, oh, okay, maybe the information belongs there, maybe it belongs there. Oh, there's like a date here as well. Oh, okay, they talked about this. So at the end of the live lecture, at the end of the 90 minutes, or even by the end of the 34 minutes here, my notes will probably look messy. It might look messy. And then as a result, I want to then just spend some time after the actual session cleaning it up. So I mean, how do I say this? How are we going to do that? We're going to take a look at the map and clean it up. And the simple way that we can do this is, number one, we just want to avoid like large arrows spiraling through the actual map. So we want to avoid like those huge arrows that are like very messy. We don't want to make it messy. We want to make it clear, and we want to make sure that we are able to recall it as well. So that's going to be the actual thing. So we should be able to navigate it a lot better. These are going to be the actual criteria that I keep at the back of my mind, and obviously we've got the grind things that we're thinking about here. And the reason that we do this is because messy notes, I guarantee you I'm not going to be able to recall this. So after I leave that live lecture, I've got all this information here, but if you were to ask me, Tanzir, can you recall your notes? I won't be able to recall all of these messy things because there's just too many elements that I have to think about, and it's not been cleaned up. So that's why I want to clean up the actual notes, because number one, inevitably it is going to be messy, and I want to accept that messiness. And number two, I want to make sure that I actually retain the information. And number three, if I'm doing another live event, so if you're going to like a workshop and there's like multiple workshops happening, there's workshop 1, workshop 2, workshop 3, and workshop 2 builds on workshop 1, I would actually want to clean this up so when I go into workshop 2, I'm not going to get destroyed. I now have, again, this kind of like goes into the cleanup process here, right? This happens afterwards. I go into the cleanup process, and this is where my learning either ends or it cycles back into the next pre-study. And so you stack your learning if that's something that you do longitudinally, if you're doing a lot more of a longer program, or if you've got multiple lectures. So this is the general process that we're going to use. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to wrap it up here, and I'm going to do my priming session. We're going to get out the timer and do it together, and then we will go ahead on recording and doing the demonstration of these 3 steps. All right, so you all know the drill. We're going to set the timer for 15 minutes. There you go. The beautiful kitchen timer that has a broken 0, so it kind of looks like a U. And what we're going to do is we're going to do the priming session. So again, how are we going to do this? We're going to set that time for 15 minutes. I'm going to quickly collect keywords. So this is before like a live lecture. You kind of know what the topic of the lecture is going to be. So you can see I'm already working with this title here, so I haven't played the video yet. Sometimes you also get the contents of the live lecture. So if you actually have access to that, we would go to ChatGPT or Claude. In this case here, I'd be like, hey Claude, can you please give me a random list of 20 keywords unordered using this title, right? And then I can go back to the video and then copy paste the timestamps as well. And then I can press enter. Here we go. And now these keywords allow me to get like a scope of what the topic might talk about. So I'm going to set that timer for 15 minutes starting now, because technically I'm starting at the moment, and we're going to do that priming session. And the goal is to find the main ideas and use my prior knowledge. So that's exactly what we're going to do in these 15 minutes. So let's take a look. Generate a random list of 20 keywords inspired by the Huberman Lab podcast episode on gratitude. So let me even read the title. What does it say? Gratitude, the science of gratitude and how to build a gratitude practice. Okay, so it's going to talk about gratitude practice a little bit. Interesting. Mindfulness, neuroplasticity, serotonin, pro-social. So these are some keywords that I'm starting to see. I might just take a screenshot of this list. Here we go. Copy that, paste it into the MacBook. Paste it into the iPad. Let me just see. It's a bit easier to work with the keywords this way. And let me start thinking about how these keywords relate. Again, I want to think about relationships first, and then I'm going to do groups, and then I'm going to think about the major groups only, just because I want to scaffold. And again, I'm only spending 15 minutes here. I've been rambling for a minute, so this is not good. All right, mindfulness. What does it kind of relate to? I kind of know mindfulness relates to... I believe mindfulness relates to a little bit of brain chemistry. Like, it should do something to your brain. It kind of makes you feel happier. And brain chemistry relates to serotonin. I know that's like a neurochemical. There has to be another one. It kind of leads to emotional self-regulation as well. Neuroplasticity. I feel like neuroplasticity relates to like habits and learning. So mindfulness also relates to mental health. I think mental health leads into a little bit of mindfulness. That's something that I'm seeing there. Well-being and mental health, I feel like they're part of the same. Well-being is like overall well-being. There's physical well-being, social well-being, then there's mental aspect there too. So that's one thing there. Connection seems to be like a social piece, self-reflection, positive psychology. Okay, so I'm seeing a theme here. One thing that I'm seeing is like actual techniques it can use, like mental techniques. That's like a group that I'm starting to see. Let me keep relating. Pro-social. Pro-social. It's like it's advocating for something social. So this means like you should socialize, I think. Pro-social, I think that relates to connection for sure. What else? Self-reflection, brain chemistry, compassion, interpersonal relationships. I feel like it relates there as well. Personal growth. I don't know. That's like the social aspect of it. Resilience seems to be a trait. Empathy seems to be I feel like empathy is like a social kind of thing. So I'm seeing a social thing, a mental thing. Motivation is like a feeling. Self-reflection, again, another technique. So there seems to be techniques being talked about here. It kind of relates with mindfulness because it's a technique that's being used. Part of psychology is a broader term. Vulnerability, compassion, stress reduction also seems like a technique or an outcome per se. Okay, all right. So there's a few things I'm thinking about here. But if I had to think about the main ideas of what's being talked about, I believe it's going to be something along the lines of well-being, and there's some things about mindfulness. So I think there's also techniques. these techniques lead into well-being is what I'm understanding and I'm seeing. And the way that they lead into well-being is like brain chemistry. That's also one thing that I'm seeing here as well. Like biological. That's something but then I'm also seeing social as well. So it feels like techniques also has a social component here too. I'm not really happy with this, I'll be very honest. I don't know if this is going very well. Let me rely on more prior knowledge, and I just need to think for a little bit. Ooh, I like this a little bit. I thought about this. So, well-being, it can be achieved by certain techniques, and there are certain techniques that are like solo, like self-sourced, but then there's also certain techniques that need to be done in a group. And I feel like gratitude actually falls under this really well. Like I feel like gratitude by definition requires like a social component. Like you can be grateful for like by yourself, but then like that's how it kind of relates. And I feel like the self is what leads into the group a little bit. Or does the group lead into the self? This is an okay one. I'm still not satisfied. Let me just rely on more thinking. Maybe gratitude has to be one of those core ideas because I feel like, okay, gratitude, mindfulness, I don't think it's really related to this topic. So I'm even going to cross it out. I just don't think it's super related to something like gratitude. Neuroplasticity as well, I don't even think that makes sense for me. Emotional intelligence, empathy, mental health, well-being. I feel like these two are just basically the same. Motivation, I see that as an outcome of gratitude. Um, hmm. Okay, this one might be good. So I'm thinking about how gratitude leads into well-being. That's actually what the argument I think is. It leads into increased well-being. And there are two things that can happen here. Number one, we talk about the mechanism in which it leads to increased well-being, but then we also talk about the precise techniques that need to be used in itself. And I feel like the techniques are what also explain the mechanism. So this is good because I'm already thinking about like the way that I formed this. The reason I thought about mechanism is because there's like a biological mechanism that occurs here, like through that neurochemistry, and then a social mechanism. So I was thinking about these two keywords before I formed mechanism. There also seems to be potentially a physical, like a, obviously there's like a mental component, but and like cognitive component as well that I need to consider. So biological, social, and cognitive, mental. Those are like the mechanisms in which gratitude, well-being is increased, and then the techniques seem to be well. Gratitude is one of those techniques in themselves. So I would link this back to this here, gratitude, and this seems to be like self-sourced. And then there's also things like mindfulness that I saw there as well. But I wonder if like there are certain variations of variations of it too that help. So there was also maybe like journaling. So I'm using a bit of prior knowledge that helps a lot. I know journaling helps a lot. There was that Yale program that I studied as well. And in that, it talked about the importance of even just doing like a little bit of visualization and kind of conceptualizing what life could look like if you didn't have certain things, visualization and anchoring. That's something that it talked about there too. So that was an interesting technique as well. Okay, I'm still not satisfied. I feel like this is too complex and not simple enough. And then gratitude, I don't know. This is one structure that could exist too, right? I just need to find a simple structure that would probably try explaining the topic really well. Why is gratitude even? Why does gratitude even matter? Okay, I think this is a simple one. Maybe this one is good. Brain. The brain leads into gratitude, and gratitude has certain inputs and outputs. Ooh, this one might be good. Input, which is like the techniques, right? And then the output is like the improvements in like happiness or well-being, right? I don't know. I feel like it's still not reflective. Oh man. So you can see there's like multiple conceptions of what I think the main ideas could be. Let me just read through this. Gratitude, practice, benefits, pro-social versus defensive. I have no idea what that is. Serotonin, brain. Can you lie to yourself? Effective gratitude tools. Yep. Tool. Benefits. Okay, so it's talking about benefits and tools a lot. So gratitude leads into benefits, and there are certain tools to achieve that as well. But then there's also like that neurological component too, that I feel like gratitude has as well. Um, oh, maybe this is a good one. Okay, I'm not going to delete that. Maybe this is a good one as well. We've got gratitude, right? But then we've got something that leads into gratitude. What leads into gratitude? Like, oh, actually, there are like techniques you can use or tools you can use to be more grateful, and those tools then lead into like a benefit. That's pretty simple, not gonna lie. That is pretty simple. I like this one a lot because I feel like it actually talks about this idea very well, and I've got 3 minutes now. I like this one. This one's very simple. There's tools that lead into gratitude, and there is a benefit that comes from that. This is super, super, super simple. I could either do input, gratitude, output. That is also super, super simple, but I think that becomes too simple. But then simple is better. Okay, so that one is fine. I feel like there's going to be input leads into gratitude, which leads into output. I feel like this is like a really simple, really basic way of thinking about it. 3 minutes left. Ugh, okay, now I need to think about something. I need to populate it a little bit with the other core ideas too. So the output leads to certain changes in the brain. That's something that we found. There are certain social changes that happen as well. And then I guess brain chemistry is one of those ones. That's a really complex word. And then social changes happen too. I actually don't think well, maybe social change. Okay, whatever. And then there's like a cognitive change that occurs maybe here, but then cognitive and brain chemistry are basically the same. Cognitive and social. Okay, yep, those are those benefits. Well-being is one of the major ideas in this. So, one would argue that ultimately, at the end of the day, it leads to increased well-being. That's actually one of the main ideas. Come on, man, how did I not know that? All right, it leads to well-being. Input. What's the input? So there's like tools. I think there's going to be like journaling involved. It talked about mindset for some like meditation as well a little bit. Maybe like actually being grateful for people as well. All right. There's that exists here too. Gratitude itself. What even is gratitude? I have no idea. Is it just the process of, I could say it's been the process of being grateful, but then, I feel like there are some things that might exist under this as well. Like, how do I even define gratitude? I'm going to quickly, all right. What is gratitude? Explain in 2 sentences. How would I explain this before I even look at this? I feel like gratitude is a process of being appreciative for the small things in your life, or being appreciative for the people, the friends, and experiences in your life, which is important because you want to be a nice person. Uh, Emotional experience, thankfulness, positive aspects, kindness, recognizing good. So I feel like it's like good over bad, I guess. Like that's what gratitude is. Thankful, right? Okay, I got 40 seconds, so I need to think about one small thing. Okay, how do I think about this a little bit? You know what? I need to make this a little bit more memorable, so I'm probably going to use a memory cue. So I'm just going to, okay, this is going to be a bit crazy, but all right. Input leads into gratitude, which leads into output. And the output usually has to go back into a little bit of well-being. I might even consolidate that. I'm already out of time, but I'm going to end my pre-study session, my priming session here by drawing, get ready for this, a boot, because I want to make it a little bit more memorable, the shape. So here we go. Here's like a shoe. And the reason I draw this is because it's actually very memorable for me. I remember like talking about being grateful for shoes when I was a lot younger. So there we go. Here's like a shoe. It's like the shape of a shoe, this main idea. So input, gratitude, output, well-being. That's what I'm seeing. And I'm going to finish this up by just populating it a little bit with those ideas that I talked about, right? So this is going to be the ideas of social and cognitive. So social here, and then cognitive here. I know I'm kind of cheating because I'm out of time. And then there's going to be like good versus like looking at the good more than the bad. I guess that's what gratitude is. And then input is like tools that you can use, and there's multiple tools that exist here. And then for well-being, there was something about, there was actually nothing under well-being. I guess it kind of relates to happiness or, whatever. And there's like brain chemistry that exists under cognitive. So, okay, cool. Basically, I'm done. That is literally my priming process. And it's not the best, I'll admit. This is probably my worst priming sessions. But that's also because I'm not like extremely familiar with something like well-being from like a neurochemical perspective either. Like this is actually quite new territory for me. So now that I'm finished with this priming, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to copy paste it over. Here we go, into a new box. And this is going to be the main study session. So this is going to be the actual session where I take the time to learn more about it as well. So here we go. There we go. Nice. And then, oh, whoops. This is actually going to be the study session where I add onto the actual details. So priming is now done. And you can see this actually puts us in a pretty good position. Now, when I press play on this video, I'm not actually starting from scratch. Like at 0 minutes, I've spent 15 minutes, which is a bit of a longer time because it's only a 34-minute video, but I'd probably couple this with another hour's worth of content. So it feels like 90 minutes. Even this type of structure, having this within the first few minutes, is actually very useful. Like this is super, super useful because now when there were certain keywords that I wasn't able to inevitably get to because my brain is actively prioritizing information, there's gonna be serotonin, pro-social, resilience. I'm gonna find a place to be able to put this into this shoe somewhere, right? The shoe that I've drawn, because there's like happy, output, etc. And I'm expecting that the structure would change, right? Okay, so let's actually do that. Let's put the video on. Put me down there, and let us play this. We're gonna start the timer. Well, I don't really need to start a timer, but I'm gonna start the timer for 34 minutes, and we are going to watch this video together, and I'm going to do the grind process, right? So I'm trying to group the information, I'm trying to make it relational, I'm trying to make it nonverbal, directional, emphasized. I've already kind of remembered this shape a little bit. It's quite easy to remember if I close my eyes. It's like a shoe, so it's like kind of like a reverse L, if that makes sense. And the shoe's like pointing that way. It's like a Converse. I'm thinking about Converses when I specifically say shoe. It's just this is like a cool memory cue that you can use. So there is going to be, and the information is kind of flowing this way. It's kind of flowing towards the right side to the mind map. So again, I'm being quite intentional about the directionality of the mind map. So we've got input, which leads into gratitude, what leads you to output, and then output leads into well-being. I might even collapse that, super simple. And then under the input, we've got tools. Under gratitude, we've got good over bad. So I guess that's what gratitude is. Look at the good things over the bad things, even though that's not actually the accurate definition. And then there is output, which has social and cognitive under it. And then there's also well-being, which has nothing under it, except for happiness that I added like a little bit. Cool. So let's watch this video together. And I'm not going to pause. I'm going to start the timer for 34 minutes and 45 seconds, and we are going to do the live event starting now.
Welcome to Huberman Lab Essentials, where we revisit past episodes for the most potent and actionable science-based tools for mental health, physical health, and performance. I'm Andrew Huberman, and I'm a professor of neurobiology and ophthalmology at Stanford School of Medicine. Today we are talking all about the science of gratitude. There's now a wealth of data showing that having an effective gratitude practice can impact a huge number of health variables, both mental health and physical health, in positive ways. However, in researching this episode, I was completely surprised as to what constitutes an effective gratitude practice. I think like many of you, would have thought that an effective gratitude practice simply involves writing down a few things or many things that we're grateful for, or thinking about those, or really making an effort to somaticize or feel some of the elements of gratitude while writing out that list or thinking about that list. It turns out that an effective gratitude practice doesn't resemble that at all. The neuroimaging data, the physiological data looking at things like inflammatory markers, other studies purely looking at the psychology and the long and short-term effects of an effective gratitude practice point to a completely different approach to using gratitude to positively impact health metrics. There are studies showing that performing a gratitude practice twice or three times or even just once a week can lead to a pervasive, a long-lasting impact on subjective well-being. People report feeling happier, more meaning, joy, even awe for their life experience, simply in response to adding a gratitude practice. But there are additional benefits of a gratitude practice. There are studies showing that a regular gratitude practice can provide resilience to trauma in two ways. It can provide a reframing and resilience to prior traumatic experiences, so buffering people against the negative physiological effects and psychological effects of earlier trauma, but also inoculating them in many ways to any traumas that might arrive later in life. The other thing that a gratitude practice does is it's been shown to benefit social relationships, but not just for the relationship in which you express gratitude, right? So on the face of it, you might think, okay, if I express gratitude for somebody over and over, then I'm going to feel better about that person. And indeed, that is one effect of a gratitude practice that's called a pro-social or intersocial gratitude practice. But there are now several studies, recent studies in good journals, pointing to the fact that a regular gratitude practice can also enhance one's social relationships across the board, in the workplace, at school, with family, in romantic relationships, and even one's relationship to themselves, which is really what the subjective feelings of well-being are. And for those of you that are coming to this conversation thinking, gratitude practice, oh, that's kind of wishy-washy or woo, it's going to involve, putting your hand on your heart and feeling into all the amazing things that you happen to have, even when things are really terrible. That's not where we're going at all. So if you are of the mindset that a gratitude practice is kind of weak sauce, buckle up, because the data actually point to the fact that a gratitude practice is a very, very potent way in which you can steer your mental and physical health in positive directions, and that those effects are very long-lasting. Before we dive into the tools and mechanisms and scientific studies around gratitude, I'd like to just set the framework for the discussion. Gratitude is what we call a pro-social behavior or a pro-social mindset. Prosocial behaviors are basically any behavior or mode of thinking that allow us to be more effective in interactions with other people, including ourselves. Now, prosocial is not just a name that we give these different tools and practices and mindsets. There are actually neural circuits in the brain that are specifically wired for prosocial thoughts and behaviors. So without getting into too much detail just yet, we will later, we have circuits in the brain that are what we call appetitive. They are designed to bring us closer to things and to bring us into closer relation to the details of that sensory experience. Now, that could be a delicious food that you're eating. It could be interacting with a loved one. It could be interacting with a friend or anyone that you happen to like. It could even be in your relation to yourself. And the neural circuits in the brain that are associated with aversive or defensive behaviors are actually antagonized, meaning they are reduced when the prosocial circuits are more active. So the framework here that I'd like to set is that we have this kind of seesaw of neural circuits in the brain, one set that are prosocial and are designed to bring us closer to others, including ourselves, closer to certain sensory experiences, right? Because a lot of prosocial behaviors can also be geared towards things like pets or food or anything that we find we want to be closer to and want more of. Whereas the defensive circuits involve areas of the brain, yes, such as areas that are involved in fear, but also areas of the brain and body that are literally associated with freezing or with backing up. So the way to think about gratitude is that it falls under this category of prosocial behaviors, which are designed to bring us closer to different types of things and to enhance the level of detail that we extract from those experiences. The key thing for today's discussion is that gratitude turns out to be one of the most potent wedges by which we can insert our thinking, and as you also see, the physiology of our body, between these two circuits and give a little more levity, if you will, to the side of the seesaw that's associated with positive prosocial feelings. And if you keep imagining this seesaw imagery, what's really beautiful about gratitude practices is that if they're performed repeatedly, and not even that often, but repeatedly, then one can actually shift their neural circuits such that the seesaw that I'm calling prosocial versus defensive behaviors can actually start to tilt. What this means is that we now know with certainty that a regular gratitude practice can shift the prosocial circuit so that they dominate our physiology and our mindset in ways that can enhance many, many aspects of our physical and mental health by default. So we don't always have to constantly be in practice trying to be happy. Now I'd like to talk about some of the neurochemistry and neural circuits associated with gratitude and prosocial behaviors. Numerous times on this podcast, I've talked about so-called neuromodulators. For those of you that might have forgotten or have never heard of neuromodulators before, neuromodulators are chemicals that are released in the brain and body that change the activity of other neural circuits. They make certain brain areas more likely to be active and other brain areas less likely to be active. These neuromodulators have names like dopamine, serotonin, acetylcholine, epinephrine, and so on. The main neuromodulators associated with gratitude and prosocial behaviors tends to be serotonin. Serotonin is released from a very small collection of neurons in the brainstem called the raphe, R-A-P-H-E, the raphe nucleus, and a few other places in the brain. And the raphe neurons send these little wires that we call axons out to numerous places in the brain. And they tend to increase the activity of particular neural circuits that lend themselves to more approach to particular types of experiences. That makes total sense if you think about it. Have a chemical that under certain circumstances is released in the brain that triggers the activity of neural circuits that makes the organism, you, more likely to stay in an interaction with something or even lean in and seek a more detailed interaction with that person, place, or thing. And two main brain areas are activated by these serotonergic systems, and when people experience something that makes them feel gratitude. And the amount of activation scales with how intensely the person experienced the feeling of gratitude. And those two areas have particular names. You don't need to know the names, but for those of you that want to know, they are the anterior cingulate cortex and the medial prefrontal cortex. And of course, these brain areas are connected to a number of other networks in the brain. In fact, that's how they get you or others to lean into certain experiences, because when these areas are active, certain thought processes get invoked. Those thought processes probably resemble something like, I'd like to experience more of this, or this feels really good. And then they literally feed onto your muscles via the neurons, making you happy to stay stationary if you're experiencing something you like, or to move closer to something that you find attractive to you, literally. Many of you have probably heard of the medial prefrontal cortex because this is the area of the brain that is involved in planning and in deep thinking and evaluation of different types of experiences, past, present, or future. And the reason it can be involved in so many different things, and the reason it's especially important for gratitude, is that medial prefrontal cortex sets context. Okay? It sets context, and it literally defines the meaning of your experience. How is it that medial prefrontal cortex sets the context of everything in your life? Well, it does it the following way. You have a number of circuits deeper in your brain that simply create some sensations, or they allow you, I should say, to perceive certain sensations. Let's use the example of cold exposure, something that we sometimes talk about in this podcast for other reasons. If you were to deliberately place yourself into an ice bath, it would be uncomfortable, even if you're adapted to cold and so forth. The discomfort is non-negotiable. However, if you are doing it because you want to, or because you have knowledge that there are particular health benefits, the medial prefrontal cortex can then control areas of your deeper brain, like the hypothalamus, to positively impact the neurochemicals that are released into your system. Your knowledge that you are making the choice, that it's you that's deciding to put yourself through this discomfort, has been shown to create a very different and positive effect on things like dopamine, on things like anti-inflammatory markers in your immune system, etc., compared to if someone pushes you into an ice bath, or if you are doing it because someone insists that you do it and you really, really don't want to. So there's a very subtle distinction here. It's just the distinction of motivation and desire, or lack of motivation and being forced into something. So if you take a mouse, for instance, and it runs on a running wheel, which mice really like to do, there are many positive effects on reducing blood pressure, improvements in neurochemistry, etc., in that mouse. However, if there's a mouse in the cage right next to it that's trapped in the running wheel and it has to run every time the other mouse runs because the wheels are linked, well, then the second mouse that's forced to do the exact same running experiences negative shifts in their overall health metrics. Blood pressure goes up, stress hormones go up, etc., because it's not actually making the choice. Medial prefrontal cortex is the knob, or the switch rather, that can take one experience and allow us to frame it such that it creates positive health effects, and the exact same experience framed as something we don't want to do or that we are forced to do can create negative health effects. Now, how exactly the neurons in medial prefrontal cortex do that is rather complicated and frankly not completely understood. But it's somehow able to adjust the activity of other neural circuits that are purely reflexive, as we say in neuroscience, like really dumb neural circuits that are just like switches, and place a context onto it. So gratitude is a mindset that activates prefrontal cortex, and in doing so sets the context of your experience such that you can derive tremendous health benefits, which leads us to the question, what kind of gratitude practice is going to accomplish this? You can't simply lie to yourself. You can't simply say, oh, well, every experience is a learning experience, or, a terrible thing happens, oh, good. I'm just going to say good, and that your body will react as if it's good for you. That's a myth, and frankly, it's a myth that's fairly pervasive in the self-help and self-actualization literature. We can't simply lie to ourselves or quote-unquote fake it until we make it. Neural circuitry is very powerful and very plastic. It can be modified, and it's very context-dependent, but it's not stupid. And when you lie to yourself about whether or not an experience is actually good for you or not, your brain knows. So what does an effective gratitude practice look like? Well, let's examine what a poor gratitude practice looks like, because therein lies some really important information, including the fact that I think millions of other people out there are doing it wrong. Most gratitude practices that you see online and that people talk about, in various talks and so forth involves something like writing down or reciting or thinking about 5 or 10 or 3 or 20 things that you're especially grateful for, and then really trying to feel into some of those, really try and think deeply about the emotions, the sensations, the perceptions that are associated with those particular people, places, and things on your list. Most studies actually point to the fact that that style of gratitude practice is not particularly effective in shifting your neural circuitry, your neural chemistry, or your somatic circuitry, the circuits in your body, because you literally have organs and neural circuits that are connected, the circuits of your brain and body, toward enhanced activation of prefrontal cortex, enhanced activation of these pro-social neural networks that we were talking about earlier. Turns out that the most potent form of gratitude practice is not a gratitude practice where you give gratitude or express gratitude, but rather where you receive gratitude, where you receive thanks. And this, to me, was very surprising. There are a number of studies about this now. One in particular that I think is interesting is called prefrontal activation while listening to a letter of gratitude read aloud by a coworker face-to-face, a NIRS study, NIRS. I'll explain what all this means. You now know what the prefrontal activation part is. This is activation of the prefrontal cortex. The NIRS, N-I-R-S study, that's just a technical term.
Yeah,
so in this particular experiment, what they did is they had coworkers write a letter of gratitude, of thanks to another coworker, unbeknownst to the other coworker, and then they sat down together and then they imaged brain activity as this letter was being read and as the letter was being heard, received. And it showed very robust effects on these prefrontal networks that pointed to the fact that receiving gratitude is actually much more potent in terms of the positive shifts that it can create than giving gratitude. For many people who want to experience the positive effects of gratitude, it's probably not the most advantageous approach to just sit around waiting, hoping that someone's going to deliver all these letters or words of gratitude. How is it that you can create that sense of receiving gratitude for yourself and thereby derive the effects of gratitude as outlined in this particular study? And there we go to the important work of the great Antonio Damasio, who explored these neural correlates of gratitude to define the areas of the brain that are associated with prosocial behaviors like the prefrontal cortex. What they did was interesting. Rather than have people express gratitude, they had the subjects go into the scanner, so their brains are being imaged, and they watched narratives, stories about other people experiencing positive things in their life. And in this case, these were powerful stories. These were stories about survivors of genocide. So that's what they're watching. The subjects were subjects that were not survivors of genocide. So they were watching these videotapes of people that had survived genocide and had people help them along the way as part of their story of survival, either psychological and or obviously they survived long enough to make the videos, so or physical survival. So within these stories, there was a conveyance of a lot of struggle. These people talked about the horrible situations they were in, but also small but highly significant features of their history that had led to their own feelings of gratitude. So, for instance, it says a woman at the this is literally from the scientific paper. Somebody had been sick for weeks. So the woman's describing how she'd been sick for weeks, and then another prisoner who was a doctor finds a particular medicine somehow, it doesn't describe how, and literally saves her life. So these sorts of stories. Now, just hearing this in the context of nothing but a scientific paper and discussion, these probably aren't that impactful. What's really important about this study, and is really important for all of us to know, is that these stories of other people receiving things that were powerful for them in their life trajectory is embedded in story. And the human brain, especially, is so oriented towards story. We have neural circuits that like to link together past, present, future, have different characters, protagonists and antagonists. From the time we're very young until the time we're very old, story is one of the major ways that we organize information in the brain. There does seem to be storytelling and story listening circuits in the brain. So what's important is not simply that these people survived genocide. That's obviously important and wonderful, but it's not just that they were helped along the way. It's that the description of their help is embedded in a larger story. Mm-hmm. So the human subject is in this scientific study is watching these powerful stories. And the neural circuits associated with prosocial behaviors and with gratitude become robustly active when they start to feel some affiliation with the person telling the story. So if you think about the earlier study that receiving gratitude is the most powerful way to activate these circuits for gratitude, the subjects in this study in many ways are receiving a sense of gratitude, but through the narrative of one of these other subjects, which I find fascinating. You know, I would have thought a great gratitude practice would be sit down and list out all the things you're grateful for. That just seems so logical to me. But it turns out that these neural circuits don't work that way, that to really activate these circuits for gratitude and the serotonin and probably the oxytocin system as well and its prefrontal networks, one has to powerfully associate with the idea of receiving help. So let's just take a moment and start to think about how we are going to build out the ultimate gratitude practice, meaning the most effective gratitude practice for us to do because of all the many positive effects that an effective gratitude practice can have if it's the proper one. It's very clear that receiving gratitude is powerful, but it's also very clear that waiting around to receive that gratitude is an impractical approach. What we know for sure is that there has to be a real experience of somebody else's experience, and that the best way to do that is story. So in thinking about how to build out an effective gratitude practice, it's very worthwhile, I believe, to find someone's narrative that's powerful for you. In many ways to think about this is it's got to be a story that inspires you because of the, for lack of a better phrase, the beauty of the human spirit or the ability of humans to help other humans. And I find this remarkable because what this really means is that the circuits for gratitude are such that we can exchange gratitude. We can actually observe someone else getting help, someone else giving help, and that observation of our species doing that for one another allows us to experience the feeling of a genuine chemical and neural circuit activation lift, if you will. Very, very different than simply writing out the things that you're thankful for, right? And so how would you do this? Well, people digest story in a number of different ways. People watch movies, people listen to podcasts, people read books. There are a tremendous number of stories out there. It's clear that an effective gratitude practice has to be repeated from time to time. So what I would not suggest is that we build a protocol in which you're constantly foraging for inspirational stories over and over again. Rather, the most effective protocol or tool is going to be either to think into, and you could write this out if you like, but think into when somebody was thankful for something that you did and really start to think about how you felt in receiving that gratitude, or I should say, imagining or thinking about deeply the emotional experience of somebody else receiving help. I want to emphasize that the story that you select does not have to have any semblance to your own life experience. It's just about what happens to move you. And so the way that one could do this is to find a story that's particularly meaningful for you, and then to just take some short notes, bullet point notes. Just list out, for instance, what the struggle was, what the help was, and something about how that impacts you emotionally. You've written down a few notes about what that story is, just to remind you. And then you read those out and you think into the richness of that experience, that receiving of gratitude. Now, this could be done literally for 1 minute or 2 minutes or 3 minutes. This is not an extensively long practice. Now, if you have an experience of receiving gratitude or a story that's very potent for you, it becomes a sort of shortcut into the gratitude network, these prosocial networks, meaning the activation of these circuits becomes almost instantaneous. And that's very different than a lot of other practices out there. Now, there's another very clear and positive effect of using this narrative or story-based approach to a gratitude practice. And that's what story does for our physiology. what this means for your gratitude practice is that having a story that you can return to over and over again, even if it's not the entire story, you're just using the shorthand bullet point version of your story, will create a perceptible and real shift in your heartbeat and in your breathing. And actually, that's been demonstrated over and over now, that an effective gratitude practice is one that can rapidly shift not just the activation of these circuits in your brain for prosocial behaviors, but also activation of particular circuits in your heart and in your lungs and the other organs of your body, such that you can get into a reproducible state of gratitude each time. The key thing is that you want to use the same story, even if it's your own experience or somebody else's, and keep coming back to it over and over again. That makes it a very potent tool that you can get a tremendous amount of benefit from with even as short as 60 seconds of practice. Earlier, I talked about how you can't lie to yourself and say, I'm so grateful for this thing that I actually hate. There's a really interesting study published in Scientific Reports, which is a Nature research journal. The title of it is Neural Responses to Intention and Benefit Appraisal Are Critical in Distinguishing Gratitude and Joy. It's a somewhat complicated study, so I'm just going to hit on some of the high points. But basically what they did is they used functional magnetic resonance imaging. So they could look at brain circuitry activation with very high precision. And they had people receiving money in the context of this experiment. And they had some knowledge as to whether or not the money that they were receiving was given to them wholeheartedly or reluctantly. They looked at whether or not the sense of gratitude scaled with the amount of money received and or the intention of the benefactor, whether or not the person giving the money was doing it wholeheartedly or reluctantly. And what's remarkable is that while the amount of money given was a strong component in whether or not somebody felt that they had received gratitude, which makes sense. The amount of money is some metric of whether or not somebody feels thanked. The stronger variable, the bigger impact, came from whether or not the person giving the money was giving it with a wholehearted intention and not a reluctant intention. This tells us many things that extend way beyond gratitude practices, which is that genuine thanks are what count. So this constrains our gratitude practices somewhat, but I think in an interesting and important way. You can't tell yourself that an experience was great or that, I got a lot of money and therefore it justified it, even though, I think that they gave it to me reluctantly, or my boss hates me, but they gave me a raise. And that tells us that if we are the giver, that we better be giving wholeheartedly, or we are undermining the sense of gratitude that someone is going to receive from us. So we are gradually building up the ultimate gratitude practice based on the variety of scientific literature that's out there. And I know that many people are probably interested in developing a gratitude practice that has long-lasting, maybe even permanent positive effects on their neural circuitry. So with that in mind, I want to turn our attention to a really interesting study. It's entitled Effects of Gratitude Meditation on Neural Network Functional Connectivity and Brain-Heart Coupling.
Mindfulness meditation.
To make a long story short and a lot simpler than that title, repeated gratitude practice changes the way that your brain circuits work. And it also changes the way in which your heart and your brain interact. You're familiar with the fact that your brain controls your heart because you can be stressed about something that's perceived with your brain, and then your heart rate will speed up. You're probably also familiar with the fact that if your heart rate speeds up for some reason or no reason, you probably think, well, what's making my heart rate speed up? And that's because the brain and the heart are reciprocally innervated, as we say. They're talking to one another in both directions. It's a two-way highway. This study looked at changes in so-called functional connectivity within the brain and between the brain and the heart in response to gratitude practices. To make a long story short, what they found is that a repeated gratitude practice could change the resting state functional connectivity in emotion and motivation-related brain regions. If I haven't mentioned a strong enough incentive for doing a regular gratitude practice until now, this is definitely the one to pay attention to. Because what they found was a regular gratitude practice could shift the functional connectivity of emotion pathways in ways that made anxiety and fear circuits less likely to be active, and circuits for feelings of well-being, but also motivation, to be much more active. I find that remarkable and important because a number of people struggle with issues of motivation. A lot of people who are highly motivated also have issues with anxiety and fear. And so this study really points to the fact that it's a twofer. If you have a good gratitude practice and you repeat it regularly, you reduce the fear anxiety circuits, you increase the efficacy of the positive emotion feel-good circuits, and the circuits associated with motivation and pursuit are actually enhanced as well. Thus far, we've mainly talked about the effects of gratitude on neural circuit activation and changes, a little bit about some of the changes that are happening in terms of the body, heart rate, and breathing and so forth, but we haven't talked a lot yet about the changes in health metrics, in things like inflammation or reductions in inflammation and immunity and things of that sort. So with that in mind, I'd like to describe the results of a really interesting recent study that was published in the journal Brain Behavior and Immunity. This was published 2021. The title of the study is Exploring Neural Mechanisms of the Health Benefits of Gratitude in Women, a randomized controlled trial. The first author is Hazlitt. And basically what this paper showed was that women who had a regular gratitude practice of the sort that we've been talking about up until now showed reductions in amygdala activity, a brain area associated with threat detection, an intimate part of the fear network in the brain. So reductions in amygdala activation and large reductions in the production of something called TNF alpha, tumor necrosis factor alpha, and IL-6, interleukin 6. Now, if you happen to have listened to the episode that I did on activating your immune system and immune function, you heard about TNF alpha and IL-6. TNF alpha and IL-6 are inflammatory cytokines. These are chemicals that exist in your body and that are released from cells when there is damage or kind of a systemic stress, when your system is in duress. And in the short term, they can be beneficial. They can call in signals for wound healing and repair of cells, et cetera. But you don't want TNF alpha and IL-6 levels to be too high, and you don't want those levels to be up for too long. And so this study is really nice because they showed significant effects in reducing TNF alpha and IL-6 in response to a gratitude practice. And another interesting aspect of this study is that the reductions in amygdala activation and the reductions in TNF alpha and IL-6 were very rapid. They occurred almost immediately after the gratitude practice was completed. And even though that study was performed exclusively on female subjects, based on the biology and circuitry of the amygdala and the biology of TNF alpha and IL-6,
that's also a nuance I could include if I wanted to differentiate between female and male
women. I don't see any reason why the results of that study wouldn't pertain to both men and women. I'd like to just highlight the key elements of the most effective, at least to my knowledge, gratitude practice. First of all, that practice has to be grounded in a narrative, meaning a story. You don't have to recite or hear that story every single time you do the gratitude practice, but you have to know what that story was and what the gratitude practice references back to. Second of all, that story can be one of you receiving genuine thanks. And the key elements there are that you are the one receiving the thanks, the gratitude, and that it's being given to you genuinely, wholeheartedly. Or it can be a story of you observing someone else receiving thanks or expressing thanks. And that has to be a genuine interaction as well, both between the giver and the receiver. So those are the first three elements. What I recommend would be, after you've established the story that you want to use for your gratitude practice, that you write down 3 or 4 simple bullet points that can serve as salient reminders of that story for you. It will serve as kind of a cue for that story without having to listen to or talk out the entire story. I would recommend writing down something about the state that you or the other person were in before they received the gratitude, the state that you were in or that the person was in after they received the gratitude, and any other elements that lend some sort of emotional weight or tone to the story. This could be 3 pages of text if you like, or it could just be a couple bullet points. I don't think it really matters. The important thing is that it's embedded in your memory and that it's really associated with this genuine exchange of thanks and the receival of thanks. I think those are the key elements. And then it's very simple. The entire practice involves reading off these bullet points as a cue to your nervous system of the sense of gratitude. And then for about 1 minute, which is a trivial amount of time if you really think about it, or maybe 2 minutes, or if you're really ambitious, up to 5 minutes of just really feeling into that genuine experience of having received gratitude or observed someone else receiving gratitude. So if we just take a step back from this protocol and compare it to what's typically out there in the literature, which is, make a list of all the things you're thankful for, recite in your mind all the things you're thankful for, count your blessings. So I think everybody should be counting their blessings all the time. There's always something to be thankful for. But in terms of a scientifically grounded gratitude practice that is also scientifically demonstrated to shift your physiology at the level of your immune system and your neural circuitry, reducing anxiety, increasing motivation, all these wonderful things that so many of us are chasing all the time as goals, I think a gratitude practice reveals itself to be an immensely powerful tool. Thank you for your time and attention today, learning about the science of gratitude. And last but certainly not least, thank you for your...
There we go. All right. So that's the session done. Boom. All right. So you can see that's me trying to apply the mind map, and it is messy. Okay. It is pretty messy, but you can see there are certain elements that I tried applying from the grind set that we talked about in terms of trying to make sure that I am using my initial representation. You can see how I changed from the shoe. I changed from a shoe to a watermelon as my actual anchor, right? And look at all these notes. These are so messy, but mentally, anything that was in yellow, I quickly just thought details. I probably don't need to pay attention to it. I come back to it later. It's so isolated, like IL-6 and TNF. I mean, it kind of relates to inflammation, and inflammation kind of relates to, the body, and then body kind of relates back to brain. So you can see here, the reason this technique was so powerful was because this gave me a structure to start placing these things rapidly and just offloading them and just being like, yep, I can forget about that. So if we just take a look at this map that I've created here, you'll see if I just split this into like 4 quadrants, the fact that I was able to be like, yep, IL-6, TNF just fits into the top right, like this quadrant here. If we want to call this like the first quadrant, this is the second, this is the third, this is the fourth, right? If we just decide to do that, you can see that allowed me to have this spatial component of this note taking. That's why, like, I would say that mind mapping is superior. That spatial component where my brain was like, yep, it belongs there. The information belongs there. I had to make that decision that it connects here as opposed to it being here. It doesn't belong here because there's nothing to do with IL-6 and TNF down in this part of the mind map. It doesn't belong there. So I'm making that decision, if that makes sense. And you can see there's so many things here. I was talking about genocide, and all I could think about was, Gaza and then Palestine. And so this watermelon came about, like, the watermelon is usually like an emoji that's used. And so I'm already thinking about how that's a story that people are observing. And, I personally linked it to my experiences. Like, when I heard the stories about these people in Palestine, like, that's what I'm thinking about. So watermelon was like the first thing that came to my mind, right? There was also shoe that came, like these Converses that came, because it's like, oh, like, I remember being grateful for buying these shoes, and it's kind of absurd. I remember doing a presentation on, so this is back in grade 5, like we had to be grateful for something, and I remember like a lot of people are bringing souvenirs from their family and like teddy bears and, like family portraits. I just bring my shoes, and I'm like, dude, like my granddad paid for these shoes, and I remember being very grateful. It was like the weirdest presentation. I think I did really badly on that, but I did bring a weird object. So that kind of went to my mind. So it's that abstract visualization that we're doing there. And if we just go back to these, I'm trying to group the information as much as I can in terms of just putting onto the mind map. Again, the rate at which information is being thrown at me, it makes it so hard to just really do this. So, I would personally say that I'm definitely I would say that my level of encoding is going to be a little better, like a lot better than most people watching this video, just because I've had a lot of prior cognitive retraining. But even for me, it's so difficult just to keep up with everything Huberman's saying without pausing. So, if I was actually learning this, I would pause, but I just pretended that Huberman was sitting in front of me and I had no choice but to think about all this information. And this is good. I'm able to get some learning. I'm able to process the information a little bit, and I'm able to collect it. But the real learning does happen when I start to clean it up. So this is that third step. So we've just done that second step together. The third step would be to clean this map up. And how would I practically do this? I would do a few things in this. And for the sake of the video, I'm going to quickly demonstrate what this would look like. So I'll probably keep the shape because that shape really makes sense to me. But there's a few things that I'm going to start doing here. I'm going to start spacing out the information a bit more because if you were to tell me, Tanzir, recall this. All right, let's try doing this. Okay, I was only looking at the map for 5 seconds, but let me try recalling the map as much as possible. So we had that watermelon shape, so we had gratitude, and then we had output here, and then we had, no, did we actually have output there? No, we didn't have output. Ooh, we had self there, right? I'm not cheating, I'm trying to use this, and others. So this is what the whole video was basically talking about and how that influences that. There we go. Let me see how much I can recall. I probably can't recall 100%. And then with the self, something that was very interestingly talked about was the brain, and specifically here was the prefrontal cortex. That seems to be the region in the brain, prefrontal cortex, the region in the brain that activates a lot of this. And then there's also the body here. And for body, we talked about heart, etc. And the brain is responsible for the body. That's actually a pretty good direction to have. It actually said it's kind of codependent. So I might actually do that at O. I think that makes a bit more sense. And then we talked about, like heart health here, and then there was like there's like lung, etc. Everything else that's going on, all this stuff, right? These were the main ideas. I remember that. And then there was like that watermelon shape that I was thinking about, which is very memorable to me. And this visual already triggered another part of this thinking that I have. So gratitude and others. There was also something here about pro-social versus antisocial. I know the actual term was defensive, but for me, antisocial makes a bit more sense because pro versus anti is a lot easier to remember. So here we go. I would then have this lead into this and this lead into that. That's how I had it. And I remember for gratitude, there was the poor practice versus a good practice, but I remember calling this ineffective and effective. So this is called effective and this was called ineffective. Right? This is what Huberman was talking a lot about. Here we go, effective, ineffective, and then basically what the consensus was is I put this arrow here. So I put most people are unfortunately doing ineffective, but we want to be doing more effective. So this arrow is to show that most people are, the norm is ineffective, right? So that's how we clean it up. And then effective practice then leads into this favorable process in the brain, the prefrontal cortex, that's what happens. And there's a few practices here. There's two main ones that was listed, if I'm not mistaken. The first one was story, because that kind of reminded me of genocide. That's like the example was genocide survivors, I think that was. That was actually the second, well, was this the first or second? I remember there was also another keyword that I used here, which was actually receive and observe. I would say that this is observe. Yes, that's right. And observe, if I'm not mistaken, I feel like reception of gratitude it leads to slightly more serotonin release than story, if I'm not mistaken, like the genuine reception of it. So this would be, reception. So I would actually put this as like, if I had to do a sliding scale, it starts off with reception leads into observation, and then the ineffective practice was like giving. Not to say that giving didn't have any effects, because giving was still quite useful. It's just less effective. So that's like the giving that was associated with that. Here we go. All right, let me see if I could recall any other parts. I'm sure there's many. For the social, for the others part, I remember that I talked about like there was things to do with attraction here, and there was social. I'm pretty sure this is not correct, but that's how I would do it. And there's two ways you can attract. There's either you prolong, you stay there for longer, or you move towards something. That's like, this is definitely a part that I'd have to clean up a little bit more, right? Okay, then prefrontal cortex, there was serotonin that was talked about here quite a lot. And there was a lot more here. I remember it talking about leading into context and then also leading into, so context was actually very important because you could control the context and you cannot lie to yourself. So the brain knows if you're telling the truth versus lie, and you always have to tell the truth. Your brain kind of already knows that. And then gave an example of like ice bath. That's an example that he gave. And he also gave an example of a hamster. And if you have, like, it depends on your volition. So volition is like the truth, right? If you voluntarily go through suffering in an ice bath, you would enjoy it more than getting pushed into it. That's something that he said. And, I think he used that as an example. Serotonin is what increased in the brain. There was also, I remember talking a little bit about IL-6 and TNF there. So it kind of belongs here. So I would find a way to link it. TNF. Oh, actually, it probably links back here because the inflammation is what reduces. So body, maybe inflammation is here as well. So inflammation, I remember that being there. And then there was IL-6 and TNF that existed there too. And there was actually a few processes that he had for story. Step 1, it was like actually get a story. And then step 2, like make a list of the bullet points. And step 3, focus on the aspect of you receiving that gratitude, or them receiving the gratitude, actually. Yeah, like the good that occurs, right? And then I talked about how Vin actually talks about, so Vin Jiang, he actually talks about storytelling from a neurochemical perspective. He talks a little bit about that from that angle. So that's something that exists there too. Okay. Reception, yep, that's one thing here as well. And then, there's like that genuine over like fake. You kind of can't receive. It needs to be genuine. And then there's like a few studies around money, but I don't see how that fits really nicely. I'd have to watch the video again. Okay, so that seems to be most of it from what I understand. There's also giving, there's like make a list. It wasn't as effective. So you still want to make sure that you kind of do it. And I'd prioritize these. I'd try making it a certain way. Okay, and that's like the majority of the video. And this is like most of what I understand. There was a few more things. There were a few more things around serotonin and the specific parts. There was another neurochemical that was listed. There was oxytocin that was talked about that I wasn't really able to go to. There's more things about the body, specifically around the resting rate of your brain, I think, and the states. There was also, there's a few things that we talked about here where there was a few studies. I remember we talked about here too. There's other circuitry in the brain that like reduced or increased, and that was like the anxiety circuitry, which reduced, and then the motivation and empathy. Motivation circuitry increase. I remember there was something that was talked about here. That was like the female study that was done. So I might change that to circuitry if I had to redo the mind map. So it's a lot easier. And then I can do prefrontal cortex and then amygdala, because amygdala is where that anxiety one is. And then I guess motivation is related to the prefrontal cortex. So I'd have circuitry there, and then I'd make that a lot easier to take a look at. And then this is the map. I think this is a pretty good understanding. So if someone was like, hey, Tanzir, what did you learn from the 34-minute video from Huberman? I would tell you, basically, there were 3 main ideas. The core idea was gratitude itself, and gratitude leading into the self, and gratitude leading into benefits of the self and others. And then I talk about, by the way, most people, when they think about gratitude, it's actually ineffective. They think about giving gratitude, but literature demonstrates that effective gratitude practice actually involves 2 major things: reception and observation. And genocide stories was actually one way and one research that they did, and the reception of genuine feedback. And the reason this helps and the way that neurochemically manifests is through the prefrontal cortex, through the increase of serotonin and other factors as well. There's other parts of the brain like the amygdala that has reduction in anxiety. That's another separate study that was done in females. And then there was context as well. Sometimes depending on the context of the event, your brain, you can't actually lie with your brain. There's literature that suggests that you cannot lie. And there's the ice bath and there's the hamster example that he gives. And these also have influences on your body as well as influences on your social interactions too. There's a propensity to either prolong or move towards something. So that is the process for live events.